In Book 10 of the Republic, Plato expels the followers of the great poet Homer from his ideal state. He calls it the poetry of pleasure. Now we know why Plato is interested in philosophy. It's the only way that we humans can reach the entities that he called forms or ideas, entities that were eternal and changeless and were the basis for human existence. But what about poetry? Plato's interest in poetry stemmed from the crucial role poetic performance played in the educational system of Athens and the moral authority it exercised over the populace at large. Why do philosophers hate poetry? As per normal, it all starts with Plato. Poetry, music, song, and dance. These were the values and the skills that children were taught to become good citizens in Athens. Students recited and memorized the works of famous poets. Homer himself was the primary school text of ancient Greece. His verses were mined for educational material and memorized by each schoolchild. The great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, formed the basis for recitation competitions where professional performers, called rhapsodes, would recite and perform Homer before huge audiences. Athenian tragedy and comedy, performed at civic religious festivals, were teaching moments. In Aristophanes' Rani, the plays of Aeschylus and Euripides were judged according to each poet's moral effect on society. But there was a problem. As far as the philosophers were concerned, poetic education was a fraud. Poets didn't know what they were talking about. The education of the guardians of the ideal city was to be arranged by the philosophers and not by the poets, because the poets worked by mimesis. Mimesis was a threefold process in which first the poet created his material by imitating his real-life model. Then his performance, gestures, music, dance, imitated the poetic material, and finally the audience would absorb and imitate the performance of the poet on stage. Imitative poetry for Plato produced a product, the poem, which was an inferior educational tool. Plus, the poet's role as an educator meant that his technique, that is, the three aspects of mimesis, interacted by necessity with educational theories current in Athens at the time. In order to inhabit fully his material and transmit it to the audience, the poet must actually possess direct knowledge of his raw material, that is, the situations, emotions, and moral precepts of the poem itself. This technique was problematic, and it created a fusion between the personal individual performance of the poet on stage and his general poetic knowledge. In other words, the teacher would embody the moral content of his teaching. This idea that the poet must concurrently know and inhabit his material in order to transmit it to his audience was not a crazy idea of Plato, but a common sense idea current in the intellectual circles of Athens. For example, the mythological character Adrastus in Euripides' Supplices denies the ability of a poet to compose what he is not feeling personally. The very one who makes songs should rejoice in their making, for if he does not experience these things, he would not have the ability to gladden others because he himself is suffering. No, this would not be right. In Plato's dialogue The Ion, Socrates chats with a rhapsode, a professional performer of Homer. Under questioning from Socrates, the rhapsode agrees that when he sings about Andromache or Hector from the Iliad, he is in a state of madness and physically experiencing the situations he narrates. Whenever you give a good recitation and specifically thrill your audience, either of Achilles lunging at Hector or some part of the sorrows of Andromache, are you then completely sane, or do you become out of your mind, and does your soul, in some sort of ecstasy, suppose itself to be among the scenes you are describing? Because of the reliance of poetry on the character of the individual poet, it was not only the content of the poetry itself, often conservative and traditional, but the entire matrix of the poet's own character and reputation, and even the situations and technique of his performance, his movement, costume, and meter, that would create the educational impact on society that Plato was worried about. In Plato's mind, the poet as educator says he has true knowledge about an entire world of topics, morality, warfare, sailing, divination, medicine, but he can't possibly have this expertise. These topics are obviously unknown to the professional poet and also presumably impossible for one individual to acquire and teach to students. But unfortunately, especially for Socrates, this idea was not universally accepted in 5th century Athens. To Plato's contemporaries, poetry was a learned skill. Because it was a skill or art, techne, it must have a practical end. Furthermore, if poetry were a techne, it must by necessity involve knowledge, episteme, and wisdom, sophia. To what extent and in which context poetry could ever be considered a true techne is Plato's main concern in his wrangling with the poets in his dialogues. For example, after Ion expresses his inability to profitably discuss or perform the works of any other poet except for Homer, Socrates contends that an expert in poetry, the art of poetry, must be able to interpret the work of all poets, not just Homer. Poetry is a whole craft, just like painting or arithmetic or medicine. Presumably, if Ion were qualified to instruct about military generalship, he would be able to provide quality mimetic education for Plato's guardians. But he can't, and he won't. Ion's craft is not morality or generalship, but imitation. Our final conclusion is reached. The poet does not work by means of an art or a skill, but instead relies on a type of possession or divine inspiration. Plato really is not in favor of the wisdom of the poet. For him it is no wisdom really, but fraud. The poet is a fraud. He takes a mirror and reflects whatever is in it while pretending to understand and practice its context. Someone who looks as though he can do all things is a marvelous sophist, but he only seems all-wise to the ignorant. He looks like a maker, but in fact he is an imitator, not a real maker or craftsman, but a pseudo-maker of pseudo-creations. Now, the whole discussion of the battle between poetry and philosophy in Plato's Republic actually consists of two parts, whose relationship is fairly complicated. Socrates purges poetry in books 2 and 3, and then he returns to this purge in book 10 by explaining in detail what is wrong with the poetry that he eliminated. Basically, as we've talked about in book 3, Socrates expelled the poet who is indiscriminately mimetic, in short, the imitative poet, and in book 10 he defends his expulsion from his city. Now, in book 10, apart from one reference to the maker of tragedy, the poet is not really mentioned in the argument. Instead, we find that the imitator is represented by the painter. Now, this painter or artist makes all things by making appearances of them, just like the person with the mirror. Plus, because he imitates objects made by other humans, such as the bed made by the carpenter, he does not even imitate the objects of human craftsmanship as they are, but only as they appear, so he is even further removed from reality. In short, for the philosopher, the imitation of the painter, and really all imitation in general, is the imitation of an appearance, not of things as they actually are in the world. An imitation is a semblance or an eidolon that is far from the truth, and the imitator is thus completely a fraud. Ironically, in many respects, Plato's famous evil poet stands for what many of us actually value in poetry. He creates his poems in response to the entire spectacle of human society. Now, Plato casts out this poet on the ground that this emotional intensity feeds and strengthens the part of the soul that he wasn't interested in, the emotional part of the soul, while weakening the rational part, a very Platonic idea. All right, guys, we're going to leave it there. There's so much more to say on that topic, but more to come. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.